Good evening and welcome to RFL. I am Richard French. 49 people killed, 53 people injured, more than 200 shots fired, all that adding up to the worst mass shooting in American history and the biggest terror attack on U.S. soil since 9/11. The FBI investigating, families mourning, and as usual when something so horrible happens, more questions than answers. Let's go live to Orlando with Marcy Gonzalez.
And several vigils are planned for tonight in other parts of Orlando. But here at the scene, the focus is still on the investigation and piecing together this nightmare that for so many people is still sinking in.
From the horrors of yesterday to the heartbreaking confirmation today, dozens of families now learning their loved ones are among the victims.
We missed him. We missed him. We love him.
At the scene where 49 people were so viciously killed, investigators collecting evidence as federal authorities delve into the killer's past.
It appears that the shooter was inspired by various extremist information that was disseminated over the internet.
29-year-old Omar Mateen was interviewed by the FBI 3 times in 2013 and 2014 for possible links to terrorism.
But he also had a lot of hatred for people, black people, women, nor did he like gay or lesbian people.
But the FBI deemed Mateen was not a threat, and he was able to buy the assault rifle and handgun used in the attacks legally.
He passed the background check.
Mateen using them to unleash 3 hours of terror early Sunday inside this gay nightclub during Latin night, in the midst of which he called 911, pledging loyalty to ISIS.
But he also appeared to claim solidarity with the perpetrators of the Boston Marathon bombing and solidarity with a Florida man who died as a suicide bomber in Syria, which adds a little bit to the confusion about his motives.
And Mateen was killed by a SWAT team here, and we learned today they decided to break through a wall here when Mateen threatened to strap bombs onto hostages. Live in Orlando, Marcy Gonzalez, ABC News. Now back to you.
Thank you very much, Marcy. Over the course of this hour, we're going to look at a whole bunch of angles to this with our panel. But first, I want to bring in a guest with an interesting perspective on this, both from the federal level and then also on a personal level. I spoke with Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney earlier today. He's a Democrat and the first openly gay member of Congress representing the state of New York. You wrote an open letter after the tragedy saying we needed to have in this country a serious and a rigorous conversation, among other things, about the threats posed by gun violence, terrorism, and anti-LGBT hatred. Let's start with the terrorism front. As the facts that we know now, the shooter was on more than one occasion interviewed by the feds. There never seemed to be enough actual intelligence, though, to detain him. But he was never red flagged, and none of it, I guess, was communicated to the local authorities. Do we need to rethink when we question somebody but they don't meet the threshold to be arrested or detained, that nonetheless there's a database where we share that information?
Yes, and look, there are many very important questions to answer here, and none of us should prejudge it, and we should remember that the FBI does a remarkable job, the local law enforcement folks involved here did a remarkable job, and these people put their lives on the line every day, and they have to get it right every time. Having said that, you know, this is an individual who had contacts with a known terrorist. This is someone with a history of domestic violence. This is someone who's been investigated on more than one occasion by the FBI. And then he goes out and he buys an AR-15 and ammunition. And within a matter of days, he's able to perpetrate the worst mass shooting in American history. So I'd like to know, you know, why there wasn't a red flag once a person who's been on this type of investigation list, you know, goes out and arms himself. We should know that that's an indication of imminent danger. If we're going to keep our people safe, we have to do a better job of connecting these dots. And so while the FBI has a very difficult job to do, as does all law enforcement, the fact of the matter is an individual like this should not be allowed to buy an AR-15. And we need to have better background checks for these types of weapons. And we need to make sure that if you're on the no-fly list, you can't go out and buy a semi-automatic military-style assault weapon. That's just common sense. So there's things we're not doing that have nothing to do with the Second Amendment that would keep us safer. And we also need to remember that this is a specific act of violence against the LGBT community during Pride Month. And we have a real issue of LGBT discrimination in this country and of violence. And of course, this is an issue of international terrorism, and it's a very difficult reminder that whether it's directed from abroad or whether it's inspired from abroad, we are still in the fight on this war on terror with very dangerous people who want to kill us. And all of us need to take all three of those issues seriously.
On the subject of guns, Congressman, your colleague, Congressman Himes, says he's no longer attending any more moments of silence on the floor of Congress because he thinks in many ways it's become an excuse for inaction. Senator Murphy from Connecticut went even further, saying that in many ways Congress has been complicit with the gun violence in this country with its deafening silence. Do you agree with both of them?
Yeah, I have no problem with that criticism. I think the Republican leadership in Congress has some very tough questions to answer when they look in the mirror on a number of the issues we just ticked off. I mean, as you know, over the last couple of weeks, I've been fighting a battle in the Congress to prevent a rollback of basic workplace protections for LGBT Americans that's been spearheaded by some conservative members of that Republican Party. Now, a bunch of them, to their credit, voted with me and tried to preserve those workplace protections. But on the issue of gun violence in particular, it's outrageous that they have blocked every attempt to do things in the wake of Newtown and so many other tragedies that make sense, that have nothing to do with the Second Amendment, that involve universal background checks, that involve federal gun trafficking laws, that involve better databases to keep people who are on no-fly lists because they could be terrorists from going out and buying military assault weapons like this individual did. There's no excuse for that anymore. It's only because of the power of the NRA, and good people, the people listening and the people who are hunters and sportsmen need to speak up and say, not in our name. Don't do this in our name. I know a lot of gun owners. I grew up shooting a gun. My brothers hunt and use guns. Those people aren't the problem. We all know that. And the Second Amendment's important. But we can come together in the wake of these tragedies and do more. We are not powerless.
You talked about the hatred directed to the LGBT community. We know obviously of the tragedy in Orlando, but also a tragedy averted in Los Angeles, where apparently another man armed with what's been termed an arsenal was stopped right before he was going to target that population as well. A colleague of yours in Congress, and I'm wondering how much of this messaging you think comes from not just lunatics, but what they hear. Rick Allen, who's a Republican from Georgia, in a closed-door meeting with other Republicans, he read biblical verses which, in effect, said not too indirectly that homosexuals were worthy of death. That's a person, you share the same job title as him, he serves with you. How much hatred do you think's out there that maybe most in America don't think really exists, but maybe is right below the surface, like this guy?
Well, I worry about the hatred masquerading as religious faith. I mean, that, after all, in its most perverse version, is what ISIS is. It's perverting the peaceful faith of Islam. And there are people in our own country who are starting down that road, even if they're not nearly that far down. And that individual you're talking about led the Republican prayer. I mean, I just want people to understand, every Republican in Congress gets together in a caucus meeting most mornings in Washington, and they begin that meeting appropriately with a prayer. This individual stood up and decided to read a passage that said, gays are worthy of death, in effect, as you point out. He did that because of the effort I just spoke about to roll back workplace protections for gays and lesbians, which I and some good-hearted Republicans, pushed back on. And that was what he was getting at. And remember, the morning of this tragedy in Orlando, the lieutenant governor of the state of Texas also took a similar position. He tweeted that God will not be mocked and you reap what you sow, which is an unbelievably hateful expression of intolerance on a moment of such tragedy. So sure, we're in a fight in this country. Now, those don't represent most views in the Republican Party. Most Republicans are good and decent people. They don't want this stuff done in their name. But there comes a time when you have to stand up and be counted. And when we still can fire LGBT people in 28 or so states in America with no legal recourse, it's perfectly legal to be fired from your job for being gay in a majority of American states, then there's no excuse when people say, what are you doing about this? It's time to stand up and be counted, because there are real injustices being done every day to people because of who they are, because of who they love. And it sends the wrong message when we say we're not going to put up with that kind of intolerance, which in its most pernicious form takes the form we saw in Orlando. It's not going to work if we say we're not going to put up with it and then permit this type of discrimination on an ongoing basis. So we need to come together as a country regardless of political party and ideology, around some basic notions of our common humanity and the respect for law and the respect for our fellow citizens.
Congressman Maloney, thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up next, we turn to take a look at the investigation the FBI is undergoing right now. It is tracking the shooter's digital footprint, examining his old files, and trying to figure out exactly why he did what he did.